Hi, Devs. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Serena?
I'm good. So good to see you
Yeah,
after a
good.
long.
It has been a while.
Yeah. So how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thankful that my weekend is about to start and the weather is nice and warm here in New York.
Right, right. Thank you so much for joining us and for agreeing to do this. We were very excited here at Taleemabad to welcome you. So
Thank you.
um,
Thank you for having
So
me.
I think we'll just quickly start. And if you can, start, if you can share a bit about the work that you're doing at Sesame Workshop,
Sure.
we'll start.
Happy to. Thank you. So, I am serving as the Senior Education Manager for Sesame's International Social Impact. And essentially, what we do is run education focused programs outside of the US. Um, Many of you may be familiar with Sesame Street and Elmo and the television show. Um, but both in the US and internationally, we have broadcast networks or channels that feature localized versions of Sesame. We also have community outreach work. So we take what's shown on the big screen, all of those educational messages, and really bring it down to the community and school level with direct service programming. And
Right. Hmm.
yeah, as the education manager, I just oversee the educational elements, make sure that the content that we're delivering to children and their families is really taking a holistic view of children's educational needs, not just the foundational skills with literacy and math, but other elements around social emotional learning and health and safety, things that really support developing a child holistically.
Right. I think that's wonderful. So one part is educational media, which I think Sesame Street has started working or was a pioneer in that. And now in these community outreach programs, you're targeting mainstream education as well. And
Exactly.
this is like you offer these programs to existing schools, or do you have your own schools?
Existing schools. So we try to integrate our work into existing programming as much as possible. And that's done through the support of local stakeholders and government entities that see a need or have an interest in working in the preschool early years age range for children and how we can support them, whether that may be through the development of content that can be integrated into those schools or services or the co-development of brand new programming that really is appropriate for the needs of the local community.
Right. And what do you think are the most important skills that you can teach to preschoolers?
Ooh, great question. um, I think oftentimes we think that the success of a child um, is their academic performance,
Mhm.
how well they can read, how well they can write, how well they can do their basic math skills. Um,
Yeah.
and of course, that's important. But
Mm.
children need to know how to cope. They need to know how to deal with the tough things that come to them um, in life. And through that, I think how to be a pro social contributor to your community and how to really manage your emotions and deal with tough challenges is so essential.
Mhm.
Because a textbook on math won't teach you that. You really have to learn that through your social environment. And I think at an early age, it's so important that we teach children how to be good citizens, how to be good people, and just allow them to be well rounded.
Right. And I know that because, like you said, that a lot of schools actually focus on numeracy and literacy skills, and I think there's a big mindset. Even parents want that, but on social emotional learning, I think it's a new field that's emerging. So, do you guys find any problem in convincing the schools that you should maybe take on this program as well, and it will help in building this? skill for students?
That's a great question as well. I believe the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic has really shown us as a global community the importance of mental health and well being. And so there's less resistance now to the idea of teaching social emotional skills. Um, the challenge remains that the curriculum for schools as they currently exist are already jam packed. Teachers are
Right.
overworked, they're tired, and social emotional skills seems like another task on their plate for them to do. Um, so there is some resistance in that regard, but we try to advocate for integrating those skills into ongoing programming as much as possible so that it's not just another task. We also think that it's important to reach out to the families. Families
Mm.
and other community members also play an important role in children's lives. It's not all the
Yeah.
responsibility of the teacher. And so we try to take it as much as possible as a community approach, and try to integrate these skills into places where it makes sense and ideally serves a whole purpose for the teachers in a way that doesn't weigh them down.
Right. Okay, that's great. And what impact do you see? Like, what kind of changes do you see in a children's behavior compared to the ones that don't take this program?
From an impact standpoint, I wouldn't say that I'm the most qualified to speak on that for Sesame. We do have a pretty impressive research and monitoring team that can really provide some insights on that. But from a qualitative standpoint, we definitely hear so much feedback from families, from community members about the value that these
Mm.
programs bring, especially
Right.
since we provide this type of programming in many different types of formats that children can reach in whatever way is best for them, whether that be at school, whether that be online, whether that be through community based activities. And so the development of this resource, of these programs, is really essential for making sure that we reach children where they are.
Right. And basically, you design these programs, you design the curriculum for these programs, right?
Correct. Yes.
So when you're designing them, what do you keep in mind? You have to train the local community, the teacher who's going to teach. So how do you design them?
Well, the most important thing that we keep into consideration is what the actual needs are. Before we start designing anything, we develop a needs assessment and really take into account what the stakeholders are illustrating as the main objective for the program. So that's number one. What is the community telling us is a
Mm.
need? And then we take that data as well as secondary data review and feed those types of information into the development of the program so that we are creating ideally content and programming that's evidence based, and contextualized for meeting the needs of the communities that we're working in, and making sure that they are actually represented in the content.
Right. All right. So Sesame Street was famous for these for running broadcast sessions, and then now they're also targeting schools. What kind of difference do you see in both mediums? One is, I think, directly targeting kids. The other is through schools. So, which one do you think is more impactful?
Hmm. I would say that both have impact in different ways. Um,
Right.
Children, especially the young children that we target in that, critical 3 to 4 year old age, um, they really rely on their caregivers. They really need the support of family, of teachers, of community members to help them develop. They can't do it on their own. So
Mm.
having those community facing programs in schools and in child friendly spaces really allows for that relationship building to happen with the essential caregivers in children's lives. But we
Right.
also recognize that 3 to 4 year olds, just like
Mm.
us as adults, are accessing media, and
Yeah.
it's a part of daily life now.
Yeah.
Billions of people are regularly on Facebook, on YouTube, on watching television, and so reaching children on the platforms that they already are accessing is another way for us to um, directly reach children with the key messages in a way that really speaks to them. So there's one aspect of the face-to-face interactions and working with
Yeah.
the caregivers. Then
Mm.
there's the other side of how can we create content that really speaks directly to children in a way that is interesting to them and can be well understood by them.
Mm. Yeah. I think we also tried this similar thing in Pakistan, where we created this educational content, which was directly targeting to students, first through app, then broadcast. But I think this face-to-face thing, especially through schools, it's really when you target mainstream education. Otherwise, I guess it becomes a complementary program. You can watch it whenever you want, and I guess impact evaluation becomes a bit more difficult in that case when you're just focusing on, I think, the media part. But I think Sesame Street was able to make a huge difference through that broadcast media and really disrupt the industry. So I guess yeah.
Yeah, I
So
definitely agree. I think what you're highlighting is the layered approach.
yeah.
We have to reach children where they are. And
Mm.
we know that the pandemic has only accelerated the learning crisis even more. And we have more and more children that aren't returning to schools, especially girls. But
Yeah.
they may still have access to some form of media, whether it
Mm.
be their television or their caregiver's phone, or a community radio. And so we try to take that layered approach of not just keeping it isolated into one way of doing things, but multiple ways in the hopes that we can really reach as many children as possible.
Hmm. Right. So I think you rightly pointed out that COVID really affected education industry, and I guess because edtech was somewhat there, but not really built up. But still, if we had a few good startups, then they really provided filled that gap. What do you think are like the gaps that emerged and the problems that really emerged because of this that we saw in the education system after COVID?
I know that one of the biggest challenges is the lack of appreciation for the value of ed tech. It wasn't until
Yeah.
we had no other choice
Mhm.
that
Exactly.
we started to take distance learning seriously.
Yeah.
Traditional education has really been viewed as the one and only way for learning to take place. And while in person learning is incredibly valuable, especially for young children, I will
Hmm.
never deny that. I do think that complementary educational approaches, including the use of ed tech, really opens up the possibilities for reiterating learning, helping those learners that need additional reinforcement on learning topics, helping those learners who aren't regularly accessing school in person services. Maybe they're migrant populations, and so they can go to school once a week, but in other days they're having to work in their communities and not able to access their schools. I think there's just so many opportunities that ed tech really provides,
Hmm.
distance learning opportunities that help to connect learners that weren't connected before because all of the focus was on in person. There was one option. And now ed tech and distance learning really provides multiple options. I don't think it will ever completely take over in
Mm.
person services, but I do think it helps to fill in the gaps that in person services isn't always able to meet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think after COVID, like you, I think rightly you mentioned that a lot of kids dropped out and didn't go back, especially girls, and especially because of the recent global recession. I think people are finding it very hard to send their kids to study. So, how can like what role can edtech and educational media play in addressing the needs of these kind of kids, and what can parents do? I guess.
Absolutely. Well, the role that EdTech has, media and EdTech has in this is to really make sure that there's a continuity in education. When those challenges arise, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a conflict, whether it's an environmental disaster, using EdTech and media allows for education to continue rather than education to completely stop, which was one of the challenges we saw with COVID. We didn't really know what to do. And so it took some time to figure out how to start education up. If we invest now in education through these mediums, through ed tech, through media, then the next time that there's a crisis, the next time that there's an environmental disaster, we know that we have a resource that we can rely on to help bring that continuity of education so that our learners are not missing out on the opportunity to advance in their futures. And so I think that's the biggest role that we have is we need to start making sure that we're creating these as a way to serve as a stopgap in case those types of situations happen, because they will. There will be an
Mm.
environmental disaster. There will be crisis. There will
Yeah.
be other things in the future. And so we need to be prepared now.
Right. So we do have a comment, and so I'll just read it out.
Sure.
What Sesame di- uh, what Sesame Street did really well was inculcate meaningful values in very subtle ways. Can you comment on what the best ways to achieve this are? Or any thoughts about this?
Right. Thank you for your comment. That's very insightful. Um, let's see. What values mean really changes from person to person and context to context. So, for us as Sesame, what we value, what we aim to do is help make kids stronger, smarter, and kinder. And by that,
Right.
we mean by stronger, we want them to be healthy. We want them to understand how to avoid um, preventable diseases by washing their hands properly. We want them to adhere to safety elements so that they can live long, fruitful lives. By smarter, we want to make sure that they have those foundational skills. So, literacy, numeracy, science, all these other elements. And then by kinder, we really look at those pro social behaviors. How can children value themselves and respect themselves and their bodies and respect other people and have elements of pro social behaviors instilled into them? How can they know how to apologize when they've done something that has upset someone? How can they learn that sometimes their actions may have a negative consequence? So, those are the types of values that we try to integrate into our resources, and how we communicate that varies from context to context. And that's where the needs assessment really comes into play. We don't assume that there's one message that works everywhere. We have to
Right.
communicate it in a way that works for the particular children that we're reaching. And so we take in feedback from the local stakeholders to make sure that how we're conveying those messages is really relevant.
Right. So we actually started talking about this, how to incorporate values, because like initially we discussed that mostly the focus is on major concepts about numeracy, literacy, but it's not really on character development. And then we were discussing the idea of how to incorporate those in mainstream programs, like I think you also suggested. And another thing that we were discussing was that if, let's say, if we have incorporated, how do we measure it? Like, how can we say that, okay, now the kid has become more kinder or more empathetic? So, so the kind of questions that we were dealing with. So, how do you guys work on this?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely the critical area, right? You say that you want to create these values, but how do we go about actually seeing whether it worked or not?
Mm,
Um, I would be more than happy, Sabina, to connect you all with our research and monitoring team because they do have some of those metrics that help um, identify those indicators
mm,
of success in making children kinder. One way that I can say, just from a top level view, is that um, we really look to see how much of the message children understand in the content, which is why it's so important that when we're developing these resources, that children are really at the center of the content and we present the message in a way that a child can actually understand so that
mm,
they walk away with an understanding of that message. So, for example, if we want to teach children about sharing, well, we want to show that behavior and really model that behavior. And we'll do that in a way with elements that are relatable to kids. So, um, let's say there's a child who has a ball
mm,
and doesn't want to share with other kids in the community. We'll create a story
mm,
about that and show that in a way that children can understand so that by the end they can see
mm.
the value of sharing with
Right.
others and that element of kindness so that they can model it in their lives too.
So that they can model it instantly.
Right. I think that was wonderfully described that you model the behavior, because usually I think what people do is they just define the values. Okay, this is the value and this is what you should do. And that's why I think people do know about values, but they don't practice it because they don't see other people practicing around them, which also includes teachers and parents and all of us, I guess, sometimes. So, do you provide training to teachers and parents as well on specifically this topic?
Definitely. Definitely, parents also need to be included in the conversation. Again, a 3 or 4 year old really can't do that by themselves. They need a community to help them understand that. And so we really value the role that caregivers have in a child's life and have programming where we help to support parents and their understanding of their child's positive development. For example, in Bangladesh, we work alongside BRAC, a well-known organization in
Yeah.
Bangladesh and around the world, and have some father engagement and mother engagement groups that really help to model those types of positive parenting role models with those very same parents, the parents of those children. And so we teach them the value of play, the
Mm.
value of um, en- engaging with their children, the value of nutrition and health and well being, so that they understand and get the same types of messages and can help to support that for their child.
Right. I think, yeah, absolutely, because you're right, especially. the age group that we're talking about, they really look up to their parents and teachers and elders and really learn from their behavior. So I wanted to ask about, there was a refugee character that Sesame Street introduced recently. So what was the idea behind it? Like, what did you want to teach the kids? What did they learn from it?
Absolutely. So, as I was mentioning before, we have the American version of Sesame Street, but we also have localized versions of the show all around the world. Some are ongoing, some have taken hiatus, but we've had Sesame Street all over. And one of the first introductions to Sesame working with refugee populations, or one of the most recent projects, was the Aklan Simpson show, which airs in the Middle East, and was really focused on the Syrian refugee uh, response to try to bring about resources that can help children and communities welcome newcomers to their community and really help them deal with difficult emotions that came about through the crisis. And I see a comment in the chat here about how difficult it is to teach children about emotions, and that it is difficult. And the Aklan Simpson show actually tackles some of those things, some of those elements of loneliness, or forgetting, or feeling sad about having lost something that meant something very special to them. And that is it's a difficult topic to navigate, but it is something that we know that children need help with, and even caregivers need help with, on how to express that, how to demonstrate that, and how to cope with that for a 3 or 4 year old to understand. And so
Right.
that was our first entry into the refugee approaches. When we started working in Bangladesh within Cox's Bazar and the Rohingya refugees, we saw a need for creating content that would really speak to the Rohingya community. And so that is what led to the development of the Rohingya Muppets, Noor and Aziz. And those two Muppets are integrated into our content to really help capture elements of Rohingya culture and help to preserve Rohingya culture and language and identity, and also create a resource that Rohingya children can see themselves in. Because prior to this, there really was no representation of the Rohingya people in media. And so we
Yeah.
saw that it would be important for children to see themselves in this content. And so we wanted to create that as a resource to really help children see themselves, because when they see themselves, then they can see that the stories, the messages that are in these videos can speak to them and are relevant
Right.
to them.
Hmm. I think that's wonderful. What a beautiful way to actually engage the community, because I think generally this is what is lacking in international media, that there's no local context which especially children can relate to and learn from. So I think that was a wonderful example to share. But I was also thinking that even for other kids where these refugees migrate to other places, for other kids to see a foreign person with this background, it's hard for them to understand as well. Do you think this program can help understand, make these kids understand as well, and maybe help them in understanding diversity and like people are from different backgrounds? So do you think this program helps in that too?
Absolutely. We definitely see the value of that. The reality is, globalization is here and it's to stay. We have things like the internet, Facebook, YouTube, that exposes us to so many different cultures and people and languages. And so we have to find that balance. We want to hold on to individuals' identities and their values and their culture, but also teach children about the reality that there's a whole world out there and that they are going to be exposed to aspects of those cultures at some point in their lives, whether they want to or not. That's just how it is with the nature of globalization and the internet. Um, and so we definitely want to find that balance by ideally showing children that, yes, there are differences with people, but at the end of the day, we should still be kind to one another. We should be kind to ourselves and we should be kind to others. And yes, there are differences, and that's okay. So
Yeah.
that's one of the values that we integrate.
Right. I think that's great because, like we discussed, that usually kids are exposed to just mainstream education and we don't explain these social causes to them, which is why there are always questions in their head, but they don't know how to process it because we think that, oh, you're too young to understand that. So,
Never too young, trust me. If you as the caregiver don't give them that information, they will find it somewhere else. And at that age, 3, 4 years old, they are like a sponge. They soak in so much information. So that's the time to really make sure that we have as much positive messaging as possible to shape their futures.
Hmm. Right. So we do have some comments. I do understand the concept of value education and inclusiveness, but how can we measure that children are implementing these values in their lives outside the classroom? Storytelling does help in classrooms, but what can be done if it limits to a classroom only? Right. I think first part we did talk about
Mhm.
a little bit. We touched upon that. So second is about storytelling. Right.
Right. And storytelling is one example, of course, to model that.
Hmm.
Because you can lecture to a child, but they're not going to really understand as much as if they actually have an opportunity to engage in a way that relates to them. And that is through modeling, that is through storytelling, that is through practicing those types of behaviors. Media is one way to model that, to tell the story, but there's also elements of repetition. We need to show it over and over again for
Yeah.
children to really integrate that into their thinking. And then we also need to make sure that they have caregivers that are supporting them. So you're right, the classroom is one approach. We can have that in the classroom environment, but we really need to have a community approach. So the teacher, the caregivers, neighbors, all of these people that play an important role in children's lives really should be integrated into the process. So when we're developing our programming, we try not to limit to just one approach. We try to take a
Right.
holistic approach to ideally have a more um,
Right.
a community facing intervention.
So, how do you implement this model? Like I think going to schools is a very direct and easy approach. You identify schools in a region, and then you share the content with them and train them. But how do you engage the community?
I think that's another area where media plays a big role.
Right.
For example, during the pandemic, one approach that we took was developing radio programming, um, public service announcements that could play on the radio to help caregivers receive the message about the importance of helping with their child's development, even during the lockdowns, that caregivers can help their children learn and develop even if they aren't going to school right now because of the lockdowns. And so that's one way to get the message out to the whole community. Another approach that we have done is to also help get fathers engaged in the children's development. Oftentimes, it's seen as the woman's responsibility, the mother's responsibility to care for the child, when it's really a whole family approach, a whole community approach. And so we develop resources like posters that can be uh, displayed throughout the community that shows examples of fathers helping to develop their child, whether it's helping with cleaning the child, helping with feeding the child, playing with the child, so the mother can do other things like take care of the home, or take care of herself and her own well-being too. And so it's really making sure that there's a whole community that is exposed to that type of message, so that ideally they can all start to value these types of approaches.
Right. I think that was a much needed push towards, yes, we normally think that it's the mother's responsibility, but we often forget that how important of a role fathers play in raising, and how kids actually view their fathers as role models and really look up to them. So I guess, yeah, I think we often forget that and don't include them in that ecosystem. So there was one very interesting question. Do you think we should teach children to face difficulties or always give them a comfortable environment? Very quickly.
I appreciate that question. That's a really interesting question. My sentiment is that the reality is the world isn't always going to be comfortable. Even if you try as hard as you possibly can to make a child's life comfortable, they will face challenges. And that may be as simple as their favorite toy breaks.
Yeah.
And now they're dealing with the difficulty of losing what was once their favorite toy or their favorite crayon, pencil, whatever it may be. And so it's important, in order to help them understand how to cope with difficulties, that we teach them from a young age, because then they will have success in the later years of their lives when they do face difficulties. We don't we don't ignore the fact that children will feel different emotions. They will feel fear. They will feel sadness. What we try to do is teach them what those emotions are so they can understand it, and then teach them how they can cope with that difficult emotion, so that, they understand it's normal to feel sad sometimes. When you feel sad, here are some things that you can do to help you with that emotion. And so I
Yeah.
think it's important that we do um, teach them about the different types of emotions, and the difficulties that will come to life at some point in their lives, even topics like death. Sesame Street in America had an episode where one of the characters, one of the members of the show, died. And he died in real life, and
Right.
they talked about it on the episode. And it's a hard thing to talk about with children, of course. Um, but the reality is they're impacted by all of these things. And so we should talk to children about these difficult things and make sure that they know how to cope.
Yeah, absolutely. How difficult and comfortable environment affect the kids' behavior? So I think that's also a very interesting question, because I guess if we talk about comfortable environment, if it's too comfortable for the kids, how will they behave? How will they react to it? Or maybe how will they affect their behavior later on in life?
I think it's more about the engagement and what type of engagement and stimulation children have in their environment. So the environment itself, it can be comfortable, but children need, what's more important for their development is the engagement that they have and the stimulation that they have with those that are around them. And so you can have a child in an environment where they have 20,000 toys and 20,000 storybooks, but if they don't have engagement with the people that are important to them in their lives, the caregivers, the teachers, the family members, the community members, if they don't have that type of engagement that shows the modeling of good behaviors, and coping strategies, then they're not going to be as successful. And so it's really the engagement with the caregivers that matters more than anything. And in many of the environmental elements could be very simple, homemade toys, or using things that already exist, like a pot that is used to cook rice. Well, that can be a drum for a child. It doesn't have to be so fancy and so comfortable. It has to just be an environment where the child actually has stimulation and engagement with the positive role models in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So I also wanted to talk about girls' education because I think that's something we see global trends, especially in developing countries, that the trend is that there are lesser girls going to schools. And there are multiple reasons. Some are accessibility of education, rightfully so. So, is there anything specific that Sesame Street is working on, especially towards girls' education, or how edtech and educational media can help specifically in this area?
Absolutely. Gender equity is such an important area of our work. And a lot of it comes with the messaging that we create for the community. We want parents to value both their girl and boy children. And that's one huge area that we incorporate into our caregiver facing interventions to make sure that they understand and value the girl child as much as they value the boy child. And that's one area. Another area that we incorporate is really the how we show girls in our content. Oftentimes we have this gendered approach that, girls, they're not good at math, they're not good at science, they just like art or other things that are very gendered. And so we intentionally create characters that break that gender bias and stereotype. One example is Amira, who is a brand new character who actually has a disability. She has a spinal cord injury, and so she uses a wheelchair and crutches for her mobility. But the part that's most impressive about Amira is that she loves science, and she, as an older character, teaches some of the younger characters about scientific elements. And we really want girls to be able to see themselves in that character and say, hey, if Amira can like science, I can like science too.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that is beautiful. Okay, so we have a question. What difficulties can you create for your children by making them different from other children in their communities? Should they adjust to their environment, or is it better to be different?
Interesting. Well, we definitely think that there's a value in differences. We all are different, all of us. There's no person that's exactly the same as someone else. And so we have to appreciate our differences and find mutual respect and understanding amongst one another for those differences, because those differences mean that we also all have different values that we can bring to the table, different skills. And so that's really how we approach it in Sesame. We see differences as a positive thing, and what we can how we can use that as an opportunity to learn about ourselves and other people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's one thing that really needs to be, because I think the point about difficulties and a comfortable environment, I believe that stems from that if you're too comfortable, then you're not prepared for, like we also discussed, that I think when you get it too easy, then you also fall really hard, not prepared for it. So I guess, like I think you rightly suggested, not really about um, difficult or comfortable. It's about how you engage with it, how you, for example, even if you have a very comfortable life, but how do you the thing that we talked about, diversity and people who have maybe not too comfortable lives, and uh, how do you empathize with those people and live as a broader community. So I guess, yeah, that's the thing that really needs to be focused on. So another question is, online education or physical?
That's always the question, which is better.
Yeah.
I will say that both have their value. I don't
Hmm.
think that one should replace the other. I think that we should be using ed tech, online school, as a way to help with supporting continuity of education and reinforcing education,
Hmm.
especially for learners that are struggling in a particular area. If they are needing reinforcement or tutoring on a topic, ed tech is a great way to support that continued learning.
Hmm.
And again, as I mentioned earlier, if there's another crisis, not if,
Hmm.
when
When?
there's another crisis, online schooling is going to be a great resource to help continue education during difficult times. So I think we really need to not look at it as one or the other, but rather both. They should complement each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was really nicely summed up how we should go about it. So, Debs, we have a lot of parents in the audience. Any final comments, tips that you want to share with them?
Sure. I think the most important thing is to remember that your child can learn a lot and knows a lot. And this is the most important time of their lives to continue that learning process. You, as a parent, you're really their first teacher. You are the teacher of how they can survive in life. Their teacher in school will probably teach them math, will probably teach them how to read, but you as a parent can teach them how to be good citizens and good people. And you have an important role to play in your child's development. Play with them, talk with them, read with them, do activities with them. Just show them examples of the type of person that you hope that they will eventually grow up to be.
Right. I think that was wonderful, wonderful advice, and I hope we are all able to follow this. Thank you so much, Debs. It was so wonderful to have you, and I think I personally learned so much from you because we're all in educational field, and our aim is to actually, give the best to the kids and every kid. So it was wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a great pleasure, and I hope to hear from you all soon.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you
All right.
so much. Have a great day.
You, thank you. You too. Bye.
All right. Bye.